April 12, 1945. Western Germany. Dawn. The foxhole smelled of cordite and wet earth and fear. Lucas Brenner crouched in muddy water that reached his knees, his hands shaking so hard he could barely hold the rifle. The Mauser was too heavy for his thin arms. His finger rested on the trigger, but the metal felt foreign against his skin, like something that belonged to someone else, someone older, someone who knew how to kill. American voices drifted through the morning fog, close enough to hear individual words he didn't understand, close enough to hear boots on wet leaves, close enough to die. Beside him, Heinrich Vogel wheezed with each breath, his asthma turning the cold air into razor blades in his lungs. 16 years old and already grey around the edges. They'd been together 3 weeks. It felt like 3 lifetimes. Lucas had been told the Americans would torture prisoners, that they showed no mercy to German defenders, that capture meant things worse than death. He'd believed it, because at 15 you believe what men in uniforms tell you. The GI appeared above the foxhole without warning, silhouetted against pale sky, rifle raised, face hidden in shadow. For a moment, nobody moved. Lucas stared up at the American soldier, his finger pressed against the trigger, but he couldn't pull it, not from mercy or moral consideration, just pure, freezing terror that locked every muscle in his body and stopped his breath in his throat. Then the canteen dropped beside him, metal hitting mud with a wet thud. "Drink up, kid." The voice was tired, almost gentle, nothing like the voices in the propaganda films. Lucas stared at the canteen like it might explode. What he didn't know was that this moment would define the next 50 years of his life. 6 months earlier, October 1944, Düsseldorf. Lucas Brenner had been 14 when the recruiters came to his school. Autumn in a city that was dying by degrees. Every night the bombers came. Every morning new holes appeared in the streets, new absences in the classroom. His father had been gone since Stalingrad, 2 years of silence. The official letter said, "missing in action," but Lucas's mother spoke about him in past tense. She worked 16-hour shifts at the munitions factory, came home too exhausted to argue when Lucas announced he'd volunteered for the Volkssturm, the People's Militia. Though calling it a militia was generous for what amounted to throwing children and old men into defensive positions with minimal training and weapons they couldn't operate. The Hitler Youth had always been part of Lucas's life. Weekly meetings that felt like games until suddenly they didn't. Camping trips that became combat drills. Songs around campfires that shifted into marching cadences. The transition from childhood to soldier had been so gradual he hadn't noticed until it was complete. At the recruitment center, he met Heinrich Vogel, 16, from Hamburg, with chronic asthma that should have disqualified him from any military service. But Germany was collapsing on all fronts, and bodies were bodies. They gave Heinrich a rifle anyway, and told him to breathe through his nose. Josef Klein arrived next, 14, from Munich, quiet, an artist who sketched everything he saw with careful, precise lines. He drew the recruitment poster on the wall, the heroic German youth defending his homeland. Then he drew the reality, boys with rifles too big for their hands and fear too big for their hearts. Dieter Schmidt was the youngest, 13, so small his uniform hung off him like a costume. His voice hadn't changed yet. He cried the first night in the barracks, trying to muffle the sound in his pillow. By the second night, he'd learned to cry silently. They gave them 3 weeks of training. How to load a rifle, how to dig a foxhole, how to recognize American tanks and throw Panzerfaust rockets that weighed nearly as much as Dieter did. The instructors were veterans, mostly men too injured for frontline service, assigned to transform children into something resembling soldiers. Sergeant Otto Richter had lost his left arm at Kursk. He watched the boys struggle with equipment designed for grown men and chain smoke through every lesson. His face was a mask of suppressed disgust. One evening he called Lucas aside. The sun was setting over the training field, orange light turning everything the color of old blood. Richter lit a cigarette with his good hand and studied Lucas for a long moment. "How old are you?" 15, sir." Richter exhaled smoke. My son was 14. Was. Past tense. Lucas understood. Listen to me carefully, Richter said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. When the Americans come, and they will come, you do exactly what I tell you. You surrender, you live. You hear me? Forget the propaganda. Forget the speeches about duty and sacrifice. You survive. Lucas stared at him. This was treason. This was the kind of talk that got men hanged. My son died on the Eastern Front 3 months ago, Richter continued. 14 years old. In a foxhole outside Minsk. For nothing. For absolutely nothing. He took another drag. I can't bring him back. But I can try to keep you boys alive. So when the Americans come, you put down your rifle. You raise your hands. You live to see 16. Understand? Lucas nodded. His throat was too tight to speak. But understanding and obeying were different things. And when the propaganda was everywhere, when every poster showed heroic youth defending the fatherland, when every radio broadcast promised that new weapons would turn the tide, when officers gave speeches about duty and honor, and the necessity of holding every meter of German soil, believing became easier than doubting. At 15, you believe what adults tell you, especially when those adults wear uniforms and speak with authority. Lucas believed. He believed Germany was defending civilization, believed the enemy was cruel and merciless, believed his duty was to fight until death or victory. That death in service of the fatherland was the highest honor a young man could achieve. Richter's words stayed with him, but they competed with 1,000 other voices telling him different things. March 1945, Western Front. They deployed in trucks that broke down constantly, traveled through a Germany that was barely recognizable, cities reduced to rubble, roads cratered by bombs, refugees streaming east, fleeing the American advance. The defensive position outside Aachen was nothing but hastily dug trenches in forest soil. The regular army had moved on or been destroyed. What remained were fragments, boys too young, men too old, the wounded and the desperate. Lucas shared his foxhole with Heinrich. Joseph and Dieter had positions 50 yards away. They could see each other through the trees, could call out to each other in the quiet moments between artillery barrages. The first time they saw American soldiers, it was at a distance. A patrol moving through a clearing half a mile away. 12 men, moving with the casual competence of people who'd been doing this for years, who weren't particularly worried about ambush. "Should we shoot?" Heinrich whispered. Lucas shook his head. He remembered Richter's voice. Survive. Firing would reveal their position. Bring artillery. They'd die in seconds and accomplish nothing. Better to stay hidden. Stay quiet. Hope the Americans pass by. But the Americans didn't pass by. Over the following week, they methodically cleared the forest, sector by sector. Lucas and Heinrich heard them coming. Engines, voices, the crack of rifle fire as they eliminated pockets of resistance. Each night, the American positions crept closer. Each morning, fewer German defenders remained. April 12, 1945. The morning, everything changed. Dawn came cold and wet. Rain had fallen through the night, filling the foxhole with 6 inches of muddy water. Lucas sat with his back against the earthen wall, his rifle wrapped in canvas that was supposed to keep it dry, but hadn't. His uniform soaked through. He hadn't eaten in 36 hours. Heinrich had an asthma attack around midnight that lasted 2 hours, left him exhausted and barely conscious. His breathing was audible even over the sound of rain, a wet, tearing sound that made Lucas think of paper being ripped. The American patrol appeared without warning. One moment, the forest was empty, except for dripping trees and morning fog. The next, soldiers were moving between the trunks. 8 men in olive drab, advancing in a staggered line, rifles up, alert but not panicked. Captain Nathaniel Hargrove spotted the foxhole first. He was 34, from Abilene, Texas, had been in combat since Guadalcanal, had watched friends die in every imaginable way, had learned to read terrain, spot concealment, identify threats before they became dangerous. He saw the depression in the earth, the canvas tarp, the faint movement. Standard procedure was simple: secure the position, neutralize any hostiles, move on. He approached with his rifle raised. Behind him, the rest of the patrol halted, weapons ready. Then he looked down into the foxhole and saw 2 children. The younger one, Lucas, looked maybe 15, skinny as a fence post, his uniform hanging off him like it belonged to someone else. The other was older, but clearly sick, his breathing audible from 3 yards away. Neither looked like they had any fight left. Hargrove stopped. For a long moment, nobody moved. Lucas stared up at the American soldier, his finger on the trigger, unable to pull it. Terror had frozen him solid. And Hargrove looked down at a 15-year-old German boy and saw his son, Matthew. Matt, 15 years old, back home in Abilene with his mother Elizabeth and his sister Rebecca. Safe, fed, going to school, playing baseball, living the life every 15-year-old should live. This boy in the foxhole could have been Matt's classmate, could have sat next to him in history class, could have been friends in a world where accidents of birth didn't make them enemies. Hargrove lowered his rifle slowly. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. Behind him, one of his men called out, "Captain, we got hostiles?" Hargrove studied the boys for another moment. Then he pulled the canteen from his belt and dropped it beside Lucas. The metal container landed in muddy water with a splash. "Drink up, kid." Lucas stared at the canteen like it might be poisoned. He'd been told Americans killed prisoners rather than deal with captives. Heard stories, probably propaganda, but stories nonetheless, about cruelty and torture. Hargrove waited. When Lucas didn't move, he mimed drinking, then pointed at Heinrich, who was shivering violently. "Your friend needs water. Give it to him." The words were English. Lucas didn't understand them, but the gesture was clear. Slowly, Lucas picked up the canteen. He unscrewed the cap, sniffed the contents. Just water, cold and metallic. He handed it to Heinrich. Heinrich drank in desperate gulps, water spilling down his chin. Private Jack Mueller moved forward. He was 25, from Wisconsin. His grandparents had immigrated from Germany in the 20s. He spoke the language. "Wie alt bist du?" "How old are you?" Lucas's voice came out as a whisper. 15, 15. Mueller translated. "He says 15, sir." Hargrove exhaled slowly. 15. The same age as Matt. He'd been preparing to shoot a boy the same age as his son. "Tell them to come out. Hands where we can see them. Slow." Mueller translated. Lucas and Heinrich climbed from the foxhole with difficulty. Lucas's legs had gone numb from sitting in cold water. Heinrich could barely stand, his breathing ragged and wet. They stood in the clearing, mud to their knees, arms raised, waiting for whatever came next. Hargrove pulled out his wallet. Inside was a photograph, creased and worn from being handled too many times. His family. Elizabeth in her nurse's uniform, Rebecca with pigtails, and Matt, 15 years old, same scared eyes as the German boy in front of him. He showed the photograph to Lucas. Lucas looked at the American boy in the picture, looked at Hargrove, understood nothing except that something had shifted. Some invisible line had been crossed. "Search them," Hargrove said. Mueller patted them down efficiently. The rifles were confiscated. Lucas had a pocket knife, his father's, given to him before his father left for the Eastern Front 3 years ago. The only thing he owned that mattered. Mueller examined it. A simple folding knife, blade maybe 3 inches long. He looked at Hargrove. Hargrove studied the knife, looked at Lucas's face, saw the fear of losing the last connection to his father. "Give it back to him." Mueller hesitated. "Sir? He's 15. It's his father's knife. Give it back." Mueller handed the knife to Lucas. Lucas took it carefully, stared at it in his palm, then at Hargrove, trying to understand why the enemy would return a weapon, even a small one. What he didn't understand yet was that Hargrove had children, that Hargrove knew what it meant to be a father, that Hargrove could no more take that knife than he could raise his rifle against his own son. Within the hour, they'd found Joseph and Dieter. Same story, different foxholes, boys who should have been in school, armed with weapons they barely understood, following orders from men who'd sent them to die. The four of them stood together in a clearing, muddy, exhausted, terrified. Hargrove radioed back to command. "We've got 4 prisoners, kids. Youngest looks maybe 13, need transport and medical." The response crackled back. "Secure them and continue patrol. Transport will meet you at the checkpoint." The patrol moved through the forest, with the 4 German boys in the center of the formation. Müller walked beside them, making sure neither collapsed. Heinrich's breathing had become more labored. Every 50 yards or so he'd stop, hands on knees, trying to pull air into lungs that weren't cooperating. After the 3rd stop, Hargrove called a break. The patrol set up a quick perimeter, and Hargrove dug through his pack. He pulled out a chocolate bar, D-ration, half melted, but chocolate nonetheless. He broke it into 4 pieces and gave one to each boy. Lucas held the chocolate like he'd been handed gold. He hadn't seen chocolate since before the bombing started. Sweet things had vanished from Germany years ago, consumed by the war economy that turned everything into guns and ammunition. "Eat it slow," Müller translated Hargrove's words. "If you haven't eaten in a while, it'll make you sick if you gulp it down." Lucas obeyed, letting the chocolate melt on his tongue, a sweetness almost painful after months of sawdust bread and watery soup. Beside him, Dieter ate his piece in tiny bites, savoring each one, making it last. Joseph didn't eat his chocolate. He wrapped it carefully in a piece of cloth torn from his uniform, saving it. For what, he didn't say. Maybe for proof that this had happened, that the enemy had given him something sweet instead of something cruel. They reached the checkpoint 2 hours later, a crossroads where supply trucks ran between forward positions and rear headquarters. A jeep was waiting, along with a medic. The medic took one look at Heinrich and immediately went to work, listened to his lungs with a stethoscope, checked his pulse, examined his fingernails, which had a bluish tint from oxygen deprivation. "Severe asthma, probably pneumonia developing. He needs a hospital, real one, not a field station." "Can you stabilize him for transport?" "Yeah, but he should have been hospitalized weeks ago." The medic shook his head. What the hell were they thinking? Putting him in a foxhole? Nobody had an answer to that. The medic gave Heinrich an injection of adrenaline to open his airways, wrapped him in wool blankets, loaded him into the jeep. Lucas started to follow. The medic held up a hand. "Just him for now. You look okay. They'll process you at the collection point down the road." Lucas felt panic rise. He and Heinrich had been together for weeks. Heinrich was the only familiar thing in a world that had become incomprehensible. Losing him meant being alone among enemies in a foreign land. Hargrove saw the panic. He spoke to Müller, who translated. "Your friend needs medical help. You'll see him again after he's treated. This isn't permanent separation." Lucas didn't entirely believe it, but he had no choice. The jeep drove off with Heinrich wrapped in blankets, his wheezing audible even over the engine noise. Lucas watched until it disappeared around a curve. Then he turned back to find Hargrove offering him a cigarette. Lucas didn't smoke, he was 15, but he took the cigarette anyway. Let Hargrove light it. Coughed through the first drag. Hargrove smiled slightly. "First time?" Lucas nodded. "You'll get used to it. Most soldiers do." They sat on the roadside while supply trucks rumbled past, carrying ammunition and rations forward, wounded men back. Lucas smoked the cigarette slowly, watching American soldiers go about their business, joking, complaining about the weather, sharing food from mess kits. They didn't look like the monsters from propaganda posters. They looked tired, human, ordinary. A truck arrived to take the remaining 3 boys to the POW processing center. Hargrove walked them to it. He gave each boy another chocolate bar and a warning through Müller's translation. "Don't try to run. Nobody's going to hurt you. But if you run, you'll get shot by someone who doesn't know you're just kids. Stay put. Do what you're told. You'll be fine." Lucas climbed into the truck bed where other German prisoners sat, all young, all exhausted. The truck drove south, away from the front, toward a world Lucas had never imagined. Behind them, the war continued. But for Lucas Brenner and 3 other German boys, it was over. They'd survived the thing they'd been told was impossible. They'd been captured by Americans and treated with kindness instead of cruelty. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Either the propaganda had been completely wrong, or this was an elaborate deception before the real cruelty began. Lucas sat in the truck bed, chocolate melting in his pocket, father's knife heavy against his hip, and tried to understand what had just happened. What he didn't know yet was that the American captain who'd given him water had a son named Matthew, 15 years old, same age, same scared eyes, and that Hargrove had looked into that foxhole and seen not an enemy, but somebody's child, somebody's Matt. The truck rolled through the German countryside, past destroyed villages and burned fields, past refugee columns and abandoned equipment, past the wreckage of a nation that had sent its children to fight a war they couldn't win. And in the back of that truck, Lucas Brenner held his father's knife and wondered if maybe, just maybe, everything he'd been told his entire life had been a lie. Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, April 1945. The POW processing center occupied what had once been a training facility. Rows of wooden barracks stretched across Oklahoma prairie, barbed wire, guard towers, but organized, clean, nothing like what Lucas had expected. The truck stopped at a gate where military police checked manifests, then drove through to a muddy parade ground where prisoners stood in lines waiting for processing. Lucas joined the line, standing among men decades older, all of them silent, defeated. The processing was methodical. Name, rank, unit, date of capture. Medical examination, cursory but thorough enough to identify immediate health issues. Delousing, new clothes, American uniforms with PW stenciled on the back in white paint. Then, assignment to a barracks. The soldier who processed Lucas was a corporal named Vincent Hayes. No relation to the captain who'd captured him, though the name made Lucas think of the canteen, the water. Hayes worked through an interpreter, filling out forms with bureaucratic efficiency, until he reached the age question. How old? 15. 15. The interpreter converted it. Hayes stopped writing, looked up. You sure? Lucas nodded. Hayes set down his pen and called over his shoulder. Lieutenant Pemberton, we got another kid here. Lieutenant Arthur Pemberton appeared from a back office, 29 years old, Yale graduate, had been processing prisoners for 6 months and thought nothing could surprise him anymore. But the stream of child soldiers kept proving him wrong. Pemberton looked at Lucas's intake form, then at Lucas himself. How many is that this week? 17, Hayes said. Most of them between 12 and 16. 17. Lucas felt something shift. He wasn't unique. This was systematic. Germany had sent thousands of children to fight. Same protocol, Pemberton said. Separate barracks for anyone under 18, different work assignments, extra rations. Lucas was assigned to Barrack 7, which held about 40 other young prisoners, some his age or younger. A few were barely 13. Their uniforms so oversized they looked like costumes. They sat on bunks in silence, processing trauma too fresh to articulate. That first night, Lucas lay on his bunk and tried to understand. He'd been captured. He was a prisoner. According to everything he'd been told, he should be suffering. Instead, he had a bed. An actual bed with a mattress, clean clothes, medical care. He fell asleep, waiting for the cruelty to begin. The next morning brought breakfast, oatmeal, bread, coffee. Not generous portions, but adequate, more than Lucas had eaten in months. After breakfast came work assignments. The younger prisoners were given simple tasks, cleaning barracks, assisting in kitchens, sorting supplies. Lucas was assigned to the kitchen. He spent the day washing pots under the supervision of a cook named Sergeant Wallace Brennan, 43 years old, from Atlanta, had worked in his family's restaurant before the war, spoke with a slow drawl that made every word sound deliberate. Brennan treated the German boys like any kitchen staff, showed them how to scrub properly, how to stack dishes, how to move efficiently in a crowded workspace. He wasn't cruel or kind, just matter of fact. But at one point, Brennan noticed Lucas staring at fresh bread cooling on a counter. The smell filled the kitchen. Yeast and warmth and comfort. Brennan cut a thick slice, buttered it generously, handed it to Lucas. Lucas took the bread carefully, waiting for the catch. Nothing came. Brennan just nodded and went back to work. Lucas ate the bread slowly, the butter melting on his tongue like proof of a world he'd forgotten existed. A world where people gave you food because you were hungry, not because you'd earned it or deserved it, just because you were hungry and they had food. 3 days after his capture, Lucas received word that Heinrich was recovering in a military hospital. A message came through Lieutenant Pemberton. "Your friend's doing better. Pneumonia's responding to treatment. He should be back here in a week or two." Relief hit Lucas so hard, it brought tears. Pemberton pretended not to notice. "You can write him a letter if you want. We'll make sure it gets delivered." Lucas wrote that evening, told Heinrich about the processing center, the work, the food, just facts, concrete and reassuring. Heinrich wrote back 3 days later, his handwriting shaky but legible. He described the hospital, American nurses who smiled despite the language barrier, real medicine that worked, food on trays 3 times a day. He sounded bewildered and grateful. 1 week later, the hamburger. Brennan had been watching Lucas, watching all the German boys, seeing them slowly understand that what they'd been told didn't match reality. It reminded him of his son. One morning, Brennan called Lucas over to the prep station. "I'm going to teach you something," he said. The interpreter translated. Brennan pulled out ingredients: ground beef, fresh from the commissary, onions, cheese, brioche buns he'd baked himself using his grandmother's recipe. The same recipe she'd brought from Ireland 60 years ago. How to make a hamburger. Lucas had heard of hamburgers vaguely, American food, but he'd never tasted one. Brennan showed him how to form the patties, how to season them, salt and pepper. Simple. You don't need much. Good beef speaks for itself. He fired up the portable grill. The smell of hot metal and cooking oil filled the kitchen. Then he placed the patties on the grill. The sizzle was immediate, a sound that cut through every other noise. The smell followed, beef fat rendering, meat caramelizing, onions softening in butter. The scent drifted across the kitchen, across 30 yards, unmistakable and intoxicating. Lucas hadn't smelled real meat cooking since 1943. He stood transfixed, watching Brennan work, watching the burgers cook, watching cheese melt over the patties in yellow pools, watching steam rise. Brennan assembled the hamburger with care: bottom bun, burger, cheese, onions, fresh lettuce, tomato, top bun. He plated it and handed it to Lucas. "Eat up, son." Lucas took the plate, stared at the hamburger like he'd been handed something sacred. The bun was golden brown, still warm, steam rising. He picked it up carefully, took a small bite. The taste exploded, rich, salted, fat and protein and comfort. The cheese melted and creamy, the onions sweet, the bun soft and buttery. Every element working together to create something that tasted like before the war, like safety, like home. Lucas tried to keep eating, tried to stay composed. He couldn't. He started crying, not polite tears, sobbing, shoulders shaking, unable to stop, crying while eating, tears falling into the hamburger, mixing with butter and cheese. He couldn't explain it, couldn't articulate why a hamburger would break him when capture hadn't. But the hamburger represented something. It represented a world where strangers treated you with kindness, where everything you'd been told was a lie. Brennan watched him cry, said nothing, just let the boy process it. When Lucas finally composed himself enough to speak, he asked through the interpreter, "Warum? Why you give this?" Brennan was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. "My son was named Patrick, 20 years old. He died at Normandy, June 6th, 1944. D-Day. Never made it off Omaha Beach." Brennan's voice was steady, but his hands weren't. "Before he shipped out, he wrote me a letter. Said he was fighting so kids wouldn't have to, so boys could grow up in peace, go to school, play baseball, live normal lives." He gestured to Lucas, to Joseph and Dieter working across the kitchen. "You boys are those kids Patrick was fighting for." You shouldn't have been in this war. But you were. And my son died trying to end it. I can't bring Patrick back. But I can feed you. I can show you that not everyone in this world is cruel. That kindness still exists. That food can be love. He paused. So that's reason enough. You're hungry, I have food, that's all the reason I need. The interpreter translated. Lucas listened, understanding more than just the words, understanding that this man had lost everything and still chose to give instead of take, to heal instead of hurt. Lucas finished the hamburger slowly, committing every detail to memory, the taste, the texture, the act of kindness that had shattered years of lies. When he was done, he looked at Brennan and said in halting English, words he'd been learning, "Thank you." Brennan's eyes were wet. "You're welcome, son." That night, Lucas lay in his bunk and thought about Patrick Brennan, about Sergeant Richter's son who died at 14, about all the sons destroyed by this war. He thought about Captain Hargrove, who'd given him water instead of bullets, about Brennan, who'd fed him when he was hungry. The propaganda had told him Americans were monsters. Reality had shown him they were human, tired, grieving, but still capable of mercy. Heinrich returned in late May. He'd gained weight, his face less grey, his breathing almost normal. When Lucas saw him, he felt a knot of worry loosen. They sat together that evening on the barrack steps, watching sunset over Oklahoma prairie. "I kept thinking it was a trick," Heinrich said, "that they were being nice until they decided to stop. But they never stopped." Lucas understood. He'd felt the same suspicion. "We were wrong about them," he said simply. "Not everything," Heinrich said. "They did bomb our cities. People died. But they didn't torture prisoners. That's what we were told would happen. So they lied to keep us fighting." Heinrich nodded slowly, processing the weight of that betrayal. May 1945. The day everything changed again. Lucas was peeling potatoes when the radio crackled with an announcement. Brennan turned up the volume. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Lucas set down his knife, hands trembling. It was over. Everything he'd been fighting for, everything his father had fought for, over, lost. He expected to feel devastation. Instead, he felt relief. The machinery of death had finally stopped. No more boys in foxholes, no more burning cities. The insanity had ended. Brennan saw Lucas's expression, spoke quietly through the interpreter. "War's done. You survived. That's what matters." Lucas nodded, unable to speak. He returned to peeling potatoes, vision blurred with tears. June 1945. The decision nobody expected. Official orders came through. All German POWs would be repatriated, sent home. The boys in Barrack 7 should have celebrated. They'd survived. Instead, they were terrified. Lucas spoke for them when Lieutenant Pemberton came to explain the process. "We don't want to go back." Pemberton blinked. "What?" "Germany is destroyed," Lucas said in careful English. "No homes, many no families, nothing to go back to." Heinrich added, "Here, I have medicine. In Germany, I die." Dieter, the youngest, spoke quietly. "Sergeant Brennan is more father than I remember having." Joseph said nothing, just sketched, drawing the barracks, the kitchen, the people who'd shown them kindness, trying to capture something he was about to lose. Pemberton didn't know how to respond. These were enemy nationals, POWs. The law was clear. "I'll see what I can do," he said, knowing there was probably nothing. He wrote to higher authorities, explained the situation, requested special consideration. The response was swift. All German nationals must be repatriated, no exceptions. When Pemberton delivered the news, Lucas took it without expression. He'd expected nothing different. July 1945. Goodbye. The day before they left, Hargrove came to the camp. He'd tracked down where the boys had been sent, travelled from his unit to see them one last time. He found Lucas in the kitchen. Brennan had given him the afternoon off. They sat outside the barracks, two people who'd met as enemies and become something else. Hargrove pulled out a piece of paper, wrote down an address, a PO number. "Write me," he said through the interpreter. I need to know you survived. Promise me." Lucas promised. Hargrove pulled out the photograph of his family, the one he'd shown Lucas in the forest. He held it for a moment, then gave it to Lucas. "Keep this. Remember that in another world, you and Matt could have been friends." Lucas took the photograph carefully. This American boy who was his age, who'd been safe while Lucas was in a foxhole, who could have been him in different circumstances. Brennan appeared with a piece of paper, his grandmother's hamburger recipe, handwritten, careful. "So you remember," Brennan said. "So you can make it when you're home, when you need to remember that kindness exists." Lucas took the recipe, folded it carefully, placed it next to his father's knife and Hargrove's photograph. 3 objects, proof that this had happened, that the enemy had shown mercy. The next morning, they boarded the transport ship. Lucas stood at the rail and watched America disappear. In his pocket, he carried his father's knife, Hargrove's photograph, and Brennan's recipe, and the memory of a hamburger that had changed everything. August 1945. Dusseldorf. The apartment building was still standing, miraculous given that half the block was gone. Lucas climbed stairs that creaked, found the door, knocked. His mother answered. Gaunt, prematurely aged, hair grey, but alive. When she saw him, she collapsed. Lucas caught her, held her while she sobbed. She'd been told he was killed in action, had mourned him, moved on because survival required it. And now he was here, real, alive. "I came back," Lucas said. She held him for a long time, then pulled him inside. Lucas told her about the capture, the camp, the kindness. He tried to explain why he wasn't angry at the Americans. "They could have shot me, but they didn't. They gave me food, treated me decently." His mother listened. Finally, she said, "The regime lied about everything else. Why would they tell the truth about the enemy?" That was it exactly. November 1945, the miracle. Lucas was clearing rubble from bombed buildings, back-breaking labor for minimal pay. A Red Cross messenger found him. "Lucas Brenner?" "Yes. Message from Soviet zone, about your father." Lucas's hands went numb. Inside the envelope was a single sheet. Official notification. His father was alive. Held in a Soviet POW camp. Expected release unknown, but alive. Lucas sat on rubble and cried. His father returned in February 1946, thin as a skeleton, missing 3 toes from frostbite, haunted, but alive. They sat together in the apartment. Lucas told him about the Americans, about Hargrove, about the water and the hamburger. His father wept. "They're better men than I was," he said, "better than we deserved." The letters. Lucas wrote to Hargrove in March 1946, using the APO address, careful English. He described his return, his mother, his father's survival, the devastation, the rebuilding. Hargrove wrote back 2 months later, updates on his family. Matthew was doing well, playing baseball. Elizabeth sent regards. He included a photograph, his family in front of their house in Abilene. Matthew was taller now, 16, grinning. Lucas kept the photograph, placed it next to the one Hargrove had given him in the forest. Past and present, enemy and friend. Heinrich wrote from Hamburg, going to medical school, wanted to specialize in respiratory medicine. Joseph wrote from Munich, studying art, paintings of peace. Dieter wrote from Bremen, working in a bakery, learning to cook. They all wrote to Hargrove, updating him, thanking him. Hargrove wrote back every time. He sent care packages, chocolate, coffee, small luxuries, and always Brennan's hamburger recipe, passed down. 1953, the loss. The telegram came to Hargrove's house. From Atlanta, Brennan's family. Wallace Brennan had died. Heart attack, age 51. Hargrove attended the funeral, stood in a church surrounded by Brennan's family, listened to stories about a man who'd cooked with love, who'd lost his son at Normandy and found a way to keep living. After, Hargrove approached Brennan's widow, Margaret, 70 years old, grieving. "Your husband saved lives," Hargrove told her, "not with bullets, with hamburgers." He told her about the German boys, about Lucas crying while eating. Margaret listened. Then she pulled out letters from a drawer, dozens of them, from Germany, from 4 boys who'd written to thank the man who'd fed them. "He saved these," she said, "read them every Sunday, said they reminded him why Patrick's death meant something." Hargrove wrote to Lucas that night, told him Brennan was gone. Lucas received the letter in Dusseldorf, where he now taught history, teaching students about propaganda, about seeing humanity in everyone. He wrote to Margaret Brennan, telling her that her husband had changed his life. Heinrich wrote from medical school. Dieter wrote from his bakery. Joseph wrote from his art studio. 4 letters arriving over a month. "Your husband saved us." Margaret kept those letters until she died, passed them to her grandson Connor, told him the story of how his grandfather had fought with hamburgers instead of bullets. The 1960s, new lives. Lucas immigrated to America in 1962, settled in Abilene, the same town where Hargrove lived, not by accident. He taught history at the high school, the same school Hargrove had taught at before the war. They became friends, met for coffee every Sunday. Matthew Hargrove, now 32, joined them sometimes. An engineer, married with children. He'd grown up hearing about the German boy in the foxhole. Heinrich came to Boston in 1965, worked at Massachusetts General Hospital, saved hundreds with respiratory diseases. Joseph immigrated to New York in 1968, taught art. His paintings explored mercy and transformation. Dieter came to Dallas in 1970, opened a restaurant. The signature dish was a hamburger, Brennan's recipe. The menu called it the hamburger that changed everything. They wrote to each other, and they wrote to Hargrove. Updates, photographs, proof that survival had meant something. April 1987, 42 years later. Lucas organized the reunion, sent letters to Heinrich, Joseph, Dieter, and Hargrove. 42 years since the capture, time we gathered again. Camp Gruber, April 12th. They all agreed. Camp Gruber was a museum now. The barracks still stood. But no prisoners, no war, just memory. Lucas arrived first, walked through the grounds, found Barracks 7, stood in the doorway and remembered being 15, terrified, waiting for cruelty that never came. Heinrich arrived next, walked with a cane. The asthma had left permanent damage, but he'd lived 58 years he shouldn't have had. Joseph came with sketches from 1945, preserved for 42 years. Dieter brought supplies, ingredients, a portable grill, Brennan's recipe card, laminated, worn, but legible. Then Hargrove arrived, 76 years old, moving slowly, but his eyes were the same. The 5 men stood in the parade ground, looking at each other, seeing decades in grey hair and wrinkles. Before anyone could speak, a young man approached. "Captain Hargrove." Hargrove turned. "Yes?" "I'm Connor Brennan, Wallace Brennan's grandson." The world stopped. Connor opened a wooden box. Inside were recipe cards, all in Wallace Brennan's handwriting, and on top, in a plastic sleeve, the hamburger recipe. "Grandma Margaret died last year. She told me the story before she passed, about the German boys, about the hamburgers, about how Grandpa fought with kindness. She wanted me to find you, to give you this." He handed the recipe card to Hargrove. Hargrove took it with shaking hands, looked at Brennan's familiar writing, remembered his friend. "She said Grandpa believed this recipe saved lives, that it should keep saving them." Connor looked at Lucas, at Heinrich, Joseph, Dieter. "You're them, aren't you, from the letters?" "We were," Lucas said, "a long time ago." Dieter stepped forward. "I brought everything to make the hamburgers, the way Sergeant Brennan taught me." They set up the grill on the parade ground. Dieter worked with practiced efficiency, the same proportions, the same technique, the same care. The grill fired up. The sizzle cut through 42 years. The smell followed. Beef fat, onions, the scent drifting exactly like it had in 1945. Lucas closed his eyes, and he was 15 again, breaking down while eating because kindness was real. Dieter assembled 5 hamburgers, exactly Brennan's way. He handed one to each man. Connor said what his grandfather would have said. "Eat up." They ate together. The taste was exactly the same. The butter, the beef, the comfort. Heinrich cried first, the taste bringing back everything. The hospital ship, the medicine, the 42 years that followed. Joseph cried next, thinking about all the art he'd made, all the students he'd taught. Lucas looked at Hargrove, 2 old men, a lifetime from a foxhole in Germany. "Thank you," Lucas said, "for seeing me as human when I'd forgotten I was." Hargrove's voice was thick. "You were somebody's son. How could I not?" "I've taught 3,000 students about that moment, about choosing mercy."
"All because you gave me water."
Heinrich spoke. "I've saved 600 patients, each one alive because American medicine saved me first." Dieter gestured to Connor. "I've served this hamburger to 2 million customers. Everyone gets the story." Joseph opened his portfolio, showed sketches from 1945. "These have been in museums, textbooks, seen by millions." Hargrove listened, overwhelmed. 42 years not knowing the full impact. "I just gave you water," he said quietly. "No," Lucas said. "You gave us our lives back." A car pulled up. A man got out, 57, grey at the temples. Hargrove turned. "Matt?" Matthew Hargrove smiled. "You didn't think I'd miss this?" Lucas stared. The boy from the photograph, now a man. Matt approached, extended his hand. "I've heard about you my entire life. Dad's German son." They shook hands. Matt pulled out the photograph, the one his father had shown Lucas in 1945. Creased, worn, carried across an ocean.
"Dad kept this 42 years.
Lucas reached into his pocket, pulled out his copy, the one Hargrove had given him. "I kept this, to remember that enemies can be friends, that choices matter." They stood together, 5 old men and Connor and Matthew, connected by a moment 42 years ago, by water, by a hamburger, by the choice to show kindness, the legacy. Nathaniel Hargrove died in 1992, age 81. All 4 men attended the funeral. They spoke about the captain who'd looked into a foxhole and seen a child, who'd chosen mercy. They brought hamburgers to the reception, Brennan's recipe, told the story to anyone who would listen. By the time Lucas retired from teaching in 1998, he'd taught 3,300 students. Each heard the story of the foxhole, the water, the hamburger. Many became teachers themselves, passed the story forward, the ripples spreading outward. Heinrich saved 700 patients before retiring, each alive because an American medic had decided a German boy's life was worth saving. Dieter's restaurant served its last hamburger in 2015, 2.3 million over 45 years. Each came with a story card about Sergeant Wallace Brennan. Joseph's artwork hangs in museums worldwide, images of mercy, of transformation, viewed by millions. Connor Brennan teaches cooking in Atlanta, tells the story every time, about his grandfather fighting with hamburgers. Matthew Hargrove named his son Nathaniel, told him the story of the foxhole, of the choice his grandfather made. Lucas Brenner died in 2011, age 81. His last words were in English. "Thank you, for the water, for the hamburger, for the choice to see him as human, for 42 years of ripples that became a lifetime of impact. Small acts, enormous consequences. 1 canteen of water, 1 hamburger, 4 lives, thousands touched across decades, the possibility of mercy when every structure screams for cruelty." That possibility might be the most important thing any war teaches us, if we're willing to learn it.